It's important to understand that the color white is typically going to appear closest to the user within the context of your screen layout. Because typically if light is hitting something, the brightest objects are going to be closest to the foreground and the darkest objects are going to go backwards into the background. This is why you'll see a lot of interfaces, especially when you get into mobile design and informationally dense interfaces. You'll have a light gray background and then white modules that are on top of that light gray background. But it's really a lot more delicate than just slapping in a gray and then putting a white on top. There's subtle nuances around border lines and shadows and color differences that can really play off of one another and can sometimes conflict with one another. So it's really important to nail down your white and your very, very subtle, almost white light grays when it comes to borders, dividers, background colors. And this can apply to other colors and other combinations besides just white. But for the majority of your interfaces that have a lighter kind of structure, this is going to really come into play with just those modules that you want sitting off the page. Let's take a look at some examples here. I've got two artboards here in Figma, and just to very quickly point out, this is pure black background and a pure white background. And then I got pure white here and pure black here. And then each one of these squares to the left of the pure color is 90%, 80%, 70, 60, 50, so on and so forth. So if you look at this, it almost seems like this white is kind of jumping off of the black background. Like it's starting off slow and it's jumping off. But then if you look over here, it almost looks like someone pressed on this white sheet of paper and there's a big hole right here. So this is just a quick visual example that naturally your white colors are going to jump off the screen and your darker colors are going to sit back on the screen. And this will become even more important when we get into dark UIs, but it's just as important with lighter color UIs, and it's just as important to nail your white colors and your background. Back when I was working on this Shiplify project, and again, this is like 7 years ago, so there are some issues with some other pieces of the design, but I remember really stressing over, I wanted it to just feel very, very clean because it was so informationally dense. There was a lot of information here between reference number, pounds, shipping locations, dates, places, prices, statuses, lots and lots of information. And these are some of the early designs after I had done wireframes. And I'm trying to divide all of this information with this tiny little divider. So I've got a huge giant block of very informationally dense things. And I also wanted this entire section to be tappable so you could select it. And you can see right now it looks more almost like a read-only list. And there's not a very, very clear divider. I mean, you can kind of see it, and the big reference number does kind of help divide it as well. But once I took this to the desktop view, it kind of fell apart and I couldn't quite get it to work with just the white background, even though I desperately wanted a clean white negative space design and background, because this is such dense information and I wanted it to be really clean and really nice. And so I thought, I'm going to use a white background. This is going to be great. But it just didn't quite work. So ultimately I decided to go with something like this. So I'm still using a lot of white backgrounds, but then I'm bringing in this very, very subtle gray background so that I can have these white modules kind of just sitting above the background. And now because this is its own tile, it gives me a little bit more room to divide these and kind of do things in between here. So now I can add more buttons in here like the price or the phone number, but still I could also have, you could imagine that these tiles are now tappable. And so that gray background just kind of lends itself to sitting backwards just a little bit. You can see if I went too dark, if I went too dark, then if I tried to put other buttons in the background, it'll almost end up being, it's like the darker you go, the more contrast you're going to increase and the more visual weight you're going to create. So there is a very delicate balance between hitting just the right gray and then going too dark. So you could imagine if my call to action is this really dark color, then I got to be careful when I'm using these darker gray buttons and the deactivated toggle switch here. But it does give me a little bit more room to play with these kind of sunken filter buttons. And then the more important content that's sitting on top with the white background. You can see I'm playing with the kind of gray family of buttons here with a slightly darker background with this very faint border, which gives it just enough contrast to actually feel like a button. Without this border, these grays would be too similar to really tell apart. So I'm adding this very, very subtle border that almost looks like a drop shadow, but drop shadows end up, if you don't use them very, very sparingly, they can very quickly kind of muddy up your interface. And with such high density and such a large amount of information, I didn't want to clutter things up with just another visual element. But you can tell if I go down here to the desktop, now I can carry the same exact kind of motif here where I'm using this very subtle play with the light gray and then the white elements that are sitting on top. And again, I'm referring to the structural colors here, but it allows me this interesting dynamic where now I can have this definition of my color usage where it's like, okay, now the light gray and the slightly darker gray buttons are more of like these controls and these filters. And the white tiles are now active search results. And these are tappable, clickable tiles that can be interacted with. And it doesn't really take away my primary call to action, this dark color. So my primary call to action is really, really dark color. Nothing else gets this color, but nothing else is on this gray with this big fill background. And I'm using the brand color ends up becoming the kind of secondary color. That way there's a little bit of contrast. But even though this information is incredibly dense, I've made a very distinct decision to have this like almost white, slightly light gray background for the filters, and then these white modules that are popping off the background. And that creates just enough of a visual contrast and distinction to know that it's like, okay, these are set back in the background, so I can filter everything here. And then the ones that are bringing to full whiteness, those are my options. Now, that's not to say that this is the only way that this could have been done. Someone probably could have pulled it off if everything was a white background. But then again, if I went full white background, I'd probably have to make a heavier use of borders. And with so much information, you have to be careful, because if you go overboard with your borders around your modules, borders, dividers, and then borders around the filters, it can just start to feel very, 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 very visually cluttered with too many dividers and borders. So if you can balance the white and the light gray full colors, it'll just give it a little bit more of a breathable, cleaner design look and feel. So let's take a look at some examples on the iPhone for white and almost white treatments. First up, we're going to look at the Settings app. So let's go here and just check out the way they're using white and light gray. I would say there are, just in terms of structural colors alone, there are 3 primary structural colors. We've got the white, pure white for the modules. Then we have the light gray background color. And then we have this kind of halfway in between, but still very, very light border divider color. And you can tell that they're using like a half pixel on the top and the bottom of each one of these modules, because if they weren't using that divider on the top and the bottom of the full module, the contrast wouldn't be quite as strong. The distinction between background and the white module wouldn't be quite as strong. So they use that border just to give it that extra little lift on the Z index. And then they've got a very subtle divider here below airplane mode, below Wi-Fi, and so on and so forth. And then any of these other screens, they're gonna follow that exact same pattern. And then we also kind of look at this other gray for the arrows. You can imagine if those arrows were much lighter, we wouldn't be able to see them. And if they were much darker, it would just be very, very overwhelming to see that many dark arrows. So the shape is simple on the arrows, but also the light gray is used very, very strategically here to where it has a little bit more weight than the divider, but not too much to where it would be distracting over and over and over. And so they've got this gray background that works as a nice, it's almost got a subtle blue tint to it, possibly to relate to the kind of general blue icon that you can see up here in the top left with the settings and the back buttons. So really any one of these, they're using that kind of white module color with the almost white background. All right, so let's look at Instagram here. They're only using white for their background. And they've got a very, very tiny light gray border on top of the stories here, right up there, and then also below the stories. And their header is probably just a touch of kind of a gray. It's really hard to tell, but I think it does have a tiny bit of gray in it. But they're not using any particular background color for the app because they really have a lot of photos that kind of serve as just the primary portion of the interface. So there's lots of, well, that's interesting from Justin Bieber there. There's a lot of different photos and comments and things like that that really break up the background. So they don't really need an additional element on top of all of this stuff. But then if I go to profile and I look at some of the settings in here, you can see that same white background, but that same, really similar to the settings on the iOS settings that we just looked at. They've got this very, very faint light gray border. And sometimes that light gray border is just enough to let you know that this entire thing is tappable. I can hit this entire big thing and look at the difference here on the manage your time. See, set daily reminder and the info and that arrow, this doesn't look as tappable as these do. And actually none of these all don't look quite as tappable because there's not an arrow, there's not a divider line behind them all. And it's actually a little bit inconsistent here where you've got settings, you know, they have the divider lines below the settings, but then they have these arrows with no divider lines. They are still using the divider line between, but you can tell like even here, there's a lot of negative space between following and followers. And then there's a nice amount of negative space here, but they don't quite look like tappable buttons. Even though I know that they are, I can still tap, and especially if I tap and hold on privacy, you can tell where that line goes. But just contrast this with the previous screen on settings where you do have the little dividers. It's just one of those things that you have to be very, very intentional with, and it's best to be consistent. I'm sure they're changing these designs all the time, so you might be seeing something completely different if you look at your version. But these are just some very, very subtle white and super light gray elements that I wanted to point out inside of settings and the Instagram app. And if we go to the Facebook app, we have white backgrounds for all these modules, but then a much darker divider module, really a module divider. You could see this as like a 10 pixel border all the way across, or you could see it as a really dark gray background. And the reason they're using this color, I believe, is because there's a lot of different posts that there can be. They have people you may know, they have photograph posts, image-based posts. There's a lot going on here. So they need a little bit stronger of a border or a background to divide these modules. So the more you have going on, a lot of times the more you're gonna need to separate your content with that darker color, especially if you're using a light UI, you're gonna wanna use one of those slightly darker backgrounds. And then there's also the reverse of that we'll take a look at in just a minute. But I just wanted to point out a couple of mobile examples where the white module background and then the dark gray module background were varying super light to a little bit darker in the Facebook example. And it's just good to take a look at all these different apps that have been designed over and over. They've iterated. So take screenshots of these and use them as reference when you're trying to pick your own gray background colors. Another example of where I really had to delicately balance white backgrounds with gray modules and vice versa was the SmartLine app. And you can see here, the goal here was to make it very clean, very modern. I didn't want a lot of, I tried some variations where I had bigger, darker input fields and things like that, but I really wanted it to be as minimal as possible. If you look down here, when you're selecting one of your numbers here, I just have this giant block of text that you can choose from. And then I'm bringing in some very subtle shades of green, which could technically count as a hue, like a saturated gray. But I wanted these to be slightly different than the drop downs here. It's just a very, 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 very subtle gray. But you could tell if I put a border on this, even if I brought it down right in there, that doesn't look bad. Overall, that doesn't have a bad look. And I could even do like 0.5 if I wanted to, which would be pretty similar to something like iOS does. That doesn't look bad. But it also changes the direction and the style of everything. And I wanted this very, very flat, gently tinted, gently colored version of kind of the direction of the app. So this is the direction we wanted to go. It's a constraint that I set up front, no divider lines. If you can help it, no divider lines whatsoever. I'm going to use white space and subtle color shifts to make this happen. And that meant it was harder to do, but I think it resulted in a nicer, cleaner interface than it would have looked otherwise. So even on some of these, kind of this main feed area, I'm using very, very, very subtle tinted green color here, and then nothing but negative space, because the information is not too overwhelming that it requires a border or it requires a background, especially when you compare it to some of that Shiplify carrier information type of layout. But this one, there was gonna be a bright color or an avatar for every single one. So that plus a bold name plus the white negative space around here, that kind of let it not need a border, and it didn't really need a full gray background. And in fact, we kind of decided up front, we want white backgrounds for a super clean interface. Kind of what I was trying to go for with the Shiplify, but then I ended up having to revert back because it was just too much information. So with these lower density interfaces, you can get away with less dividers, less borders, but the more information you get and the more things that are going on, sometimes then you have to bring in more elements to support the division of all of the content. So we're not using any dividers, borders around here, but we are using them when you get into this thread here. So it kind of, we wanted to mimic the native iOS to a certain degree with its own kind of SmartLine flair, but we didn't want it to be quite as dark as the normal iOS. So we're using this very, very light gray for this kind of divider. And it's just enough to let you know that this is kind of contained content. And then we're bringing in kind of that darker charcoal brand color for the user message. Even for the input field here, it's a very, very light gray with just enough contrast on the text. And you can tell that this gray on top of this white background, it kind of feels like it's sunk into the background a little bit. So input fields can work well with this dark gray color. So on a very, very practical level, if you're working on a layout and you want to go with a white background, a lot of times the best place to be is going to be in this kind of F0 range. And sometimes, you know, you might want to go anywhere from 90 brightness, which is going to get you into the E5 section. But a lot of times you can stay in this 94 to, let's say, I haven't seen many things working that are lighter than F5. I found that F5 is about as light as you can go for any significant amount of contrast that the eye can still perceive. Now, if you did want to go to like F7, F8, F9, FA, you could technically do that, but you can tell that it's really hard to perceive that difference. So F5 is about as light as I would go on any kind of gray color, even for the background. So if I reverse this and I said, okay, you know what? I want F5 here and I want this white on top. That could still work, but it's very, 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 very subtle. So you just have to be careful and mindful of what you're using these hex codes for. But this is more of a practical tip. So you can tell if I made a copy of both of these and I added a tiny little inner border, black would obviously be a little too harsh unless you were kind of going for that very harsh look, which could be cool as well. But you can start off in like the CCC range and then kind of adjust from there. So CCC is pretty good, kind of a nice gray. This is at 80% darkness. And you can see if I just play with this and I bump it up to like 85, that could possibly still work. That would be D9. Sometimes I'll try CCC. I'll try DDD because I know I'm going up in value. If I go to EEE, that would probably, that's just not quite enough. That's too subtle. Too subtle. It's not going to work. It's going to end up looking blurry and muddy on this one. But actually, if you look at this one, that almost feels like a little bit of a drop shadow, and it's a little bit more distinguishable from the white only. So if I were doing this, I'd say, okay, well, the E almost works. What if I just knock it down one notch to like ED? I might even try, okay, that one's ED. Let's see what happens if I go to like E5, which would be midway. So that could even work. Put E5 there, but it's not quite going to work for this one, I don't think. E5 could work for both of these. That's getting closer to just enough. And then the other option here would be to put a drop shadow on this thing. But you're definitely going to want to, that's not going to work. This is not a good drop shadow. You're going to want to make sure that your blur and your Y, you probably want to go to like 24 or so, maybe 20. The Y being at 4 is okay. You could probably even increase it to 8 or leave it at 4. Let's see. And then you're going to want to play with your opacity. But you can tell the drop shadow is just not really going to work on this gray module. And I'll cover a lot more about drop shadows in the style module, but that's just not going to be a good option for a gray module. For a white module, however, because the white is sitting off of the background, this is going to work okay. And so we could increase the axis, we could play around with the spread, we could really pump it up. Let's say we did 60 and let's do like 8 on the axis there. So you can see that all of these are fairly viable options. And if we wanted to really get nitty gritty, which we do, we could go back to this background and say, okay, if F5 is the absolute lightest I want to go, what if I just start knocking this down? F4, F3, F2, F1, F0. Maybe F0 is a little bit better. You can tell that this is incredibly, incredibly subtle, but these are the granular decisions that I would start to make as I'm laying this out. This is gonna look one way on your laptop, but it's also gonna be a lot different on your phone. So make sure that you're mirroring your designs to your phone if you're designing for mobile. So for homework, let's create a simple little chat app, whether it's a recreation of iOS messages, or you look at Twitter DMs or Instagram DMs, and actually look at all of the different DM methods that you have access to see how they're handling the messages and the modules that are popped off. Some of them don't use modules at all, but for this particular homework, let's have a conversation between two different people, and maybe it's a full screen. So you'll have one module that is dedicated to the person on the left, one module dedicated to the person on the right, and play around with the background color. Have one where the modules are white and the background is gray. Then reverse that where you have gray modules on a white background. And then maybe take it even further to where you're going a little bit more, you're really pushing some kind of floating module concept. Maybe you bring in some extra colors. Maybe you see what a full yellow background looks like, or a full color background. And maybe you start to introduce some drop shadows on an existing grayscale. So 3 different slightly versions of white and light gray. Maybe you try one with borders, one without, and get a feel for what looks the cleanest, what you kind of gravitate towards, and the subtle differences between those hex codes and the brightness values. So can't wait to see what you come up with, and good luck.